House official told NBC the president had been briefed via secure call by Secretary of State Tony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley. Minutes later, NBC News was first to report that President Biden was talking with President Zelensky. He later shared Zelensky reached out to him, asked him to call on world leaders to speak out clearly against Putin. We are waiting to see this morning at some point what we expect to be remarks from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I want to bring in now NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee. Carol, I know it's been a long night. It's going to be a long morning and a long day for the White House. Talk to me about when you expect we may see President Biden next and what you're hearing from the sources that you've been talking to, I know, as this has developed.
Well, look, Hallie, the big thing that the White House is trying to get aligned are sanctions and what sanctions the administration decides to do. As you know, they did some sanctions against Russia earlier this week after that initial invasion. They were not their harshest sanctions. They said that at the time they were reserving some of those for if Vladimir Putin decided to go further. He has done that. So now he escalated, and the administration is preparing to escalate as well in terms of its sanctions. They also have to get in line with Europe and America's allies. And so you'll see the president later this morning have a phone call with G7 leaders where they're going to all try to get on the same page to bring the biggest, most significant package of sanctions against Russia that they can all agree on. So the White House is trying to get its sanctions regime in order. And after that, the president is expected to speak publicly for the first time. We've already heard from him in 2 written statements. He's had some rather harsh things to say. I'll read you part of one of those statements. He said that Vladimir Putin had chosen a premeditated war that will bring catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. So really talking about the human toll that this is going to take. And then Hallie, he then vowed that the world will hold Russia accountable. So that is what we're looking for today, how the president and U.S. allies decide to hold Russia accountable.
Of course, the question is, Carol, what sanctions, right? What accountability? When you're looking at sanctions, what would deter Putin at this point, given what Ukraine has described as this full-scale military invasion of their country?
Well, I think at this point, when you talk to administration officials, and even before this point, they were under no illusions that they were going to be able to deter Putin from the moves that we've seen him make in the last few hours. This is something that they were convinced he was going to do. He now has done it. And now, in their view, it's just about making Russia pay for that, about what kind of punishment they can do. So we saw them sanction Russian banks earlier this week, some individuals who are close to Putin's inner circle, and sanction Russia's sovereign debt. Now you might see things like export controls. That's a tool they had in their kit of sanctions that they did not use earlier this week. There's that big question out there of whether they would go after SWIFT and removing Russia from SWIFT. Right. That would be very significant. And what we've heard from President Biden is that he doesn't want to take steps, or at least he's trying not to take steps, and he's trying to do this in a way that brings the least amount of pain to the U.S. economy, to Americans who are already struggling. He has warned about higher gas prices. We're seeing those. The White House is trying to come up with ways to deal with that and to bring those prices down. If he were to do some of these more significant moves, it could have an effect on the U.S. economy. So that's the calculus and the balance that they're trying to strike here.
Are we expecting any more readouts, Carol, based on your reporting and the folks you're talking to, of discussions that the president is, I assume, likely to have with other world leaders as well this morning?
Sure. We'll definitely, if past is precedent, we will get a readout from the president's call with G7 leaders. And the president probably has other phone calls that he'll be making. We know the Secretary of State has been speaking with counterparts. He spoke with the Secretary General of NATO overnight. And so there's a number of administration officials talking with their counterparts really across the government, and the president is part of that. That G7 meeting, we'll certainly get a readout from that, and then we'll hear from the president himself when he addresses the American people for the first time about this.
We are looking now, Carol, on our screens at some of the international reaction. You talked about President Biden's, a tough, aggressive tone towards Vladimir Putin, as you described. And that is similar to what we've heard from Boris Johnson, saying Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed, from the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, a brutal invasion. The new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, saying that this is a blatant violation of international law, and the Japanese Prime Minister strongly condemning Russia, working in cooperation with the U.S. and other Western nations to respond speedily. Carol, can I ask you to stand by for a second? I want to bring in somebody else to the conversation who I know you know, Eugene Daniels, a colleague in the White House press corps, correspondent for the White House for Politico, and co-author of the Playbook. Eugene, talk to me about what you are hearing in these overnight hours into the morning and what we can expect, frankly, in Playbook and in this reporting that's coming out today.
Yeah, I mean, the things that this White House is focused on, and Carol outlined that a little bit just a second ago, is trying to make sure, as they're figuring out what President Biden is going to say today, is making sure the American people know and continuing to say, which President Biden has focused on, making sure that they know the American people are not going to be sent there. The American military is not going to be sent to Ukraine, right? This president doesn't want boots on the ground there, and I think that is something we're going to hear the president say. Because when you talk to Americans as this conflict has continued for years, and the concern has always been whether or not this country is going to send folks over there, and that's already been taken off the table. So much so that the president had even taken folks out of Ukraine who were there training their military there. So that's part one. And these sanctions, these are the White House has continued to promise that these sanctions are going to be huge. And as the G7 meets today, they're all working on figuring out what are the sanctions they can all put on Russia to, in their eyes, try to stop what's going to happen and blunt it so that Russia has less of a reason to continue this. Whether that matters or not is hard to see, because Russia has already said that the sanctions are only going to hurt, in their eyes, the American people and the other countries.
Carol, let me bring you back into the conversation here as well. If I think you are still with us, yes?
I'm here.
When we're talking about the response from the White House, I think you and Eugene have both hit on something important, which is the acknowledgement to Americans that while our troops, and President Biden could not be more crystal clear about this, that he has said repeatedly, U.S. troops will not be going into Ukraine to fight. They are bolstering NATO allies. He has sent more troops over there. We know that the military has moved in more attack helicopters, more planes closer to the front lines, but not into Ukraine, right? But there is an acknowledgement to Americans that, number one, our troops will not go in. And number two, we may feel some of the impact if, in fact, Russia retaliates and there is a crunch on energy.
That's right. And Hallie, one of the things that's worth looking for today is how much the president really explains to Americans why it's worth their extra money, why they should pay more at the gas pump in order for the U.S. to punish Russia for invading Ukraine. We've heard from him that there will be economic pain. We've heard that, democracy and supporting democracy has costs, but he hasn't really full-throatedly laid out why this matters to people and why they should care, and why they should care enough that it's going to hurt them economically, and they should be okay with that, because this is something that is necessary for the country to do. So it'll be interesting to see if he leans a little bit more into that. You're absolutely right. He's been clear every time he's spoken about this that the U.S. is not going to war with Russia. That's just not what's happening here. He has at the same time, and the statement from the Secretary of State after his call with the NATO Secretary General overnight reiterated this, said that the U.S. will send troops and military assets to reinforce NATO countries, that is an obligation that the U.S. has, that it will stand by. At the same time, he's saying we're not going to war with Russia. That would be a disaster.
We are constantly getting updates from our teams on the ground because, as we noted right as we came on the air for this broadcast, it is the very early morning here, but it is just about midday in Ukraine and in Russia. And the Ukrainian foreign minister is now saying via tweet that, essentially what we have seen from our team on the ground, that this is not a Russian invasion only in the east, but describing a, quote, full-scale attack from multiple directions, saying that the Ukrainian defense has not collapsed, that the Ukrainian army took up the fight. Eugene, final thoughts to you before we shift gears and talk about some of the cyber attacks that have been happening too.
Yeah, I mean, the administration has been saying that all of the things that Russia was trying to spread, that they were just coming from the east, that they were just focusing on these other areas that Russian President Vladimir Putin has recognized, was a farce, right? And so that is something that we're seeing. And I will say this administration, this is not something that they really wanted to spend a lot of their time focusing on in the foreign policy realm. They didn't want to spend a lot of time with Russia, but Vladimir Putin once again has tossed the table as another White House has to deal with Russian aggression, and now an even more further aggression with this invasion of Ukraine. And so how the administration continues to retool the foreign policy shift that they were hoping to do, which was to China, which is other presidents have tried to do, that is the major focus of the foreign policy apparatus for a lot of what's going on right now. And we'll continue.
Eugene Daniels from Politico, Carol Lee, our NBC News White House correspondent. Thank you so much to the both of you. I'm sure we'll be seeing both your faces later this morning. I want to take a look at front pages around the country. Obviously, this is front page news. We're going to check on that when we get back. Plus, more, as we mentioned, on the other front, the other battlefield for Russia, and that is in the cyber realm. We're going to talk about those attacks in just a second as we continue our special rolling coverage right here on MSNBC.
There's an assault on democracy.
Scorching triple-digit heat. The new space race begins.
That is actually the potential America has always had.
The change might be around the corner.
Did you get a sense of what the end game is here?
What would happen in ranked choice voting?
That's just not what the facts are.
3 former intelligence officials said there's no way.
That's the heart of the matter, right?
The highly contagious Delta variant of COVID-19 was first discovered in India. Variants can develop anywhere in the world, especially in countries with the lowest vaccination rates. Providing vaccines to the world is not an act of pure generosity. It is an act of self-defense that is necessary to help protect Americans from the spread of future variants.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
Whether it's the politics of climate change, the effects of marijuana laws, or the challenges of racial injustice. Get your daily dose of enlightening articles at MSNBC Daily. Written perspectives by people you know and trust, like Alicia Menendez, Mehdi Hassan, and Frank Figluzzi, along with a growing list of experts offering their insights. Plus, a fresh take every morning from me, Hayes Brown. Start your day with MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.
One bill would eliminate the requirement that students be taught the, quote, history of white supremacy, including but not limited to the institution of slavery and the Ku Klux Klan. American history is littered with shameful policies, but it is also filled with freedom fighters. To teach our children anything else is to rob them of their heritage and the truth, and they deserve better.
When you need brutal honesty.
These conspiracy theories are not only making people stupid, they're making them sick.
When you need answers first thing in the morning.
What's the key to progress to bringing this home and getting this deal done?
When you need to go deep inside Washington.
What is the military posture of the United States now toward Afghanistan?
And hear from someone who's been there.
Perhaps the greatest threat to American democracy right now is misinformation that's being spread around.
You need your Morning Joe, only on MSNBC.
Do you feel like the bad guy in this? Why should they believe you when they know that people are getting in? Has it been worth it to make this trip? Do you feel like you're giving a green light to politicians? How do you explain why your case has become so important? We're back now from Las Vegas. From Seattle, Guatemala City. From Wilmington. I was in Space in Texas. From Normandy, from Surfside, Florida. Thank you for watching, everyone.
Think bigger. We're back with that breaking news. The Russian attack overseas in Ukraine is obviously front page news across a lot of papers this morning. Now coming out around this country, the Washington Post, check this out, showed a photo of a Russian army column close to the border of Ukraine, talking about the broad-based military assault there. The LA Times leading with Ukraine under attack. The Wall Street Journal with a picture of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressing his nation in this Russian strike. Dallas Morning News, Russia attacks Ukraine. And the San Francisco Chronicle features a photo of Andy Kurtzik, CEO of Just Answer, an online service with more than 200 employees in Ukraine, looking at a map to see where they may be relocating with those world tensions there. The New York Daily News, leading with Russia launches Ukraine attack. And then the New York Times with a photo of a Ukrainian soldier alongside the headline, Russia attacks as Putin warns the world. Biden vows to hold him accountable. Again, we expect to hear from President Biden at some point later on today. We're also hearing now from members of Congress, including Senator Marco Rubio, the top Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's been tweeting overnight about what's unfolding in Eastern Europe, saying that one very concerning development in his view is that Russia has carried out a few targeted operations uncomfortably close to the Polish border. This is the danger of miscalculation and human error, he says, that can quickly lead to a catastrophic escalation. He also said Russia's now created a new front in northern Ukraine with assistance from Belarus. This is part of the plan to carry out a double envelopment of Ukrainian forces in the east and isolate Kyiv. And this, Ukraine is outgunned and outmanned, the senator posts, but they are brave and tough fighters. And as soon the world will learn, they've already inflicted damage on Russian invaders. Again, we have heard from the Ukrainian foreign minister just in the last maybe 10, 15 minutes or so, saying that the Ukrainian Defense forces, the Ukrainian military is standing up. They are fighting. We also know of the deaths, according to the Ukrainian government, they say, of dozens of Ukrainian soldiers so far. We're also hearing from former President Donald Trump, who called into Fox News in these overnight hours and used this military attack on Ukraine by Russia to once again push his big lie. Here's some of what he had to say about Putin's decision to go ahead and conduct these military operations.
It's a terrible thing. The way it started, I really don't believe he wanted to do this initially. I think he wanted to do something and negotiate, and it just got worse and worse. And then he saw the weakness. And, you know, it really started, I think, with the weakness in Afghanistan, the way they pulled out of Afghanistan. I really believe that's where he started thinking, you know, he can do this. Now he sees the weakness and the incompetence and the stupidity of this administration. And as an American, I'm angry about it, and I'm saddened by it. And it all happened because of a rigged election.
Obviously, the election was not rigged. It was not stolen. Mr. Trump's previous praise of Vladimir Putin has drawn condemnation from Republicans like Liz Cheney, for example, who has said that that kind of adulation aids the enemy. New polling shows there's not much support among Americans for full U.S. involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But again, President Biden has made clear U.S. troops will not be going into Ukraine, he says, to fight. In the latest AP Center poll, just 26% say the U.S. should play a big role, compared to 52% who say the U.S. should take up a minor role. 20% say the U.S. should play no role at all. Still ahead, we will take you back live to Kyiv, live to Ukraine. We're going to take a look at how the markets are reacting this morning, too, as we're just a couple hours from the opening bell. We got a lot going on. We'll be right back.
What does her ascension mean to you?
Ask a simple question.
Everything. She is the first woman of color vice president.
Ask everyone you know what matters to them.
Where do we go from here?
Ask the why.
Why? Why is this happening?
The how.
How did you get your politics?
Please,
The wait a minute.
Okay.
Be tough on the answers.
It was deliberate deceit.
Favor facts over conspiracies and trust standards over hearsay.
The highly contagious Delta variant of COVID-19 was first discovered in India. Variants can develop anywhere in the world, especially in countries with the lowest vaccination rates. Providing vaccines to the world is not an act of pure generosity. It is an act of self-defense that is necessary to help protect Americans from the spread of future variants.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
Whether it's the politics of climate change, the effects of marijuana laws, or the challenges of racial injustice, get your daily dose of enlightening articles at MSNBC Daily. Written perspectives by people you know and trust, like Alicia Menendez, Mehdi Hassan, and Frank Figluzzi, along with a growing list of experts offering their insights. Plus, a fresh take every morning from me, Hayes Brown. Start your day with MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.
One bill would eliminate the requirement that students be taught the, quote, history of white supremacy, including but not limited to the institution of slavery and the Ku Klux Klan. American history is littered with shameful policies, but it is also filled with freedom fighters. To teach our children anything else is to rob them of their heritage and the truth, and they deserve better.
When you need brutal honesty.
These conspiracy theories are not only making people stupid, they're making them sick.
When you need answers first thing in the morning.
What's the key to progress to bringing this home and getting this deal done?
When you need to go deep inside Washington.
What is the military posture of the United States now toward Afghanistan?
And hear from someone who's been there.
Perhaps the greatest threat to American democracy right now is misinformation that's being spread around.
You need your Morning Joe, only on MSNBC.
Controversy in South Lake tonight after teens posted a racist video.
It was a wealthy, idyllic town forced to confront racism.
My children were told Rosa Parks is dead. You all have to sit in the back of the bus.
But when the school board presented its plan, this small town fight ignited a national firestorm.
Critical race theory. Racism in reverse.
False narrative of rampant racism.
This is South Lake, an NBC News podcast. All episodes available now. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
We're back now from Las Vegas. From Seattle, Guatemala City. From Wilmington. I was in space in Texas. From Normandy, from Surfside, Florida. Thank you for watching, everyone.
NBC.
Welcome back to our rolling coverage of the crisis in Ukraine right here on MSNBC. I'm Hallie Jackson in for Jonathan Lemire this morning, and we're following the latest overseas after that military action, of course. The attack started early in the morning, 6 a.m. local time, from neighboring Belarus, with explosions happening in several cities across Ukraine. You could hear air raid sirens in some cities. Ukrainian officials, you hear them there, reporting that cruise or ballistic missiles targeted military control centers. Joining us live from Kyiv is NBC News correspondent Erin McLaughlin. And Erin, I understand you have some new reporting from some officials in Ukraine there.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. I just received a message from the former Ukrainian defense minister who has been talking to various military officials here in Kyiv, and he's painting the picture of this assault on Ukraine. He said that the first shot came at 5 a.m. in the morning. He said that it was primarily missiles and drone strikes. He says that some buildings, armed forces mainly military installations were destroyed in those strikes. He says that right now, currently Russian forces are trying to break through the border of Ukraine in various areas, including Melitopol. He said they're quite close to the city of Kherson, and they're trying to surround Kharkiv. He says that Kharkiv, the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, seems to be the target right now. He also said they're trying to get to Kyiv, the capital where I am right now, through one battlefield group. He said, but that battlefield group has been stopped. We've seen images of some 50 tanks streaming across the Sankivka border, the border that intersects Ukraine, Belarus, as well as Russia. But according to the former defense minister, those forces have been stopped. There is a battle underway with losses on both sides. Now, in terms of the overall picture here in the capital, we were hearing a number of explosions at the top of the hour. No air raid sirens this hour. That seems to have quieted right now. It is an eerie calm that has set in once again here to Kyiv. Over my shoulder that way, I am looking at an increased police presence out on the streets as President Zelensky has announced that Kyiv is now under martial law. Hallie.
NBC's Erin McLaughlin live from Kyiv. Erin, thank you very much for that. Stay safe. We're thinking about you and your team. Appreciate you joining us. We are also watching the markets really closely to see what happens. We're looking at the futures. We're looking at what's happening overseas. Let me bring in CNBC's Rosanna Lockwood, who is live from London. We know that futures, Rosanna, fell, obviously, with this Russian attack on Ukraine. Give us a sense of the global markets this morning.
Yeah, the futures did fall. The Dow Jones was off 850 points to the downside at one point, and the US markets, they are looking like they're headed for a very weak start indeed. Now, it must be mentioned just as a footnote, the reason we're looking at the markets today, it's not about profit hunting. No one's thinking about business right now, but any countermeasures from the West against Russia to the aggression we saw overnight will likely be economic in fashion. Now, in terms of the market action here in Europe this morning, we've had all the main indexes falling 2 or 4% down to the red. Of course, Europe being on the front lines of this crisis, many European companies have a lot of links that were previously above board with Russian businesses. Sometimes European banks like to pretend like Russia's not an important part, a closely linked part of the European business economy, but it certainly is. And we're seeing that reflected today with shares in banks like Societe Generale, for example, sinking very low. The CAC 40 in Paris down as a result.
Talk about oil prices here. We know that they're now the highest, $100 a barrel, I think, since 2014, basically. This is something a lot of people are watching as well, given what's happening overseas.
Yeah, absolutely. Russia is a major oil exporter. It also exports, it must be worth noting, around a quarter of the global natural gas output. But when we think about oil, you just mentioned there, popping above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. And it didn't stop there in the session so far, actually touching $104 a barrel for Brent crude, which is what we look at heavily here in Europe and the Middle East. Meanwhile, West Texas Intermediate, that's been touching around the 98 and change level so far this morning, almost up to $99 a barrel. This, of course, is because there's going to be a very complex supply picture if we see Russian oil suddenly being a lot more difficult to handle. And that's something that traders are going to have to think about if sanctions come in a very big way, which they are likely to do so. Touching any company that has anything to do with Russian oil is going to be very complicated indeed. Also, any further aggression and conflict in Ukraine could affect natural gas supply networks as well.
CNBC's Rosanna Lockwood live for us from London. Rosanna, thank you very much. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, a closer look at where exactly Russia has been, where they are headed inside Ukraine, and what officials there are calling a full-scale attack. We'll be right back.
Get your daily dose of enlightening articles at MSNBC Daily. Written perspectives by people you know and trust, like Alicia Menendez, Mehdi Hassan, and Frank Figluzzi, along with a growing list of experts offering their insights. Plus, a fresh take every morning from me, Hayes Brown. Start your day with MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.
It was a wealthy, idyllic town forced to confront racism, but when the school board presented its plan, it ignited a national firestorm.
Critical race theory.
Racism in reverse.
False narrative.
Shame.
This is Southlake. All episodes available now.
Why not use every tool in your toolbox to get the information that you say you need to do your job and to do it effectively on day one?
Should Americans have to decide between staying healthy and going back to work?
What is the holdup here?
Should they pay some price for that?
Is that still the most realistic timeline?
What sort of legal risk does that carry?
Can we trust the information we're getting?
Would you be willing to go it alone with a Democrat-only option?
When you need brutal honesty.
These conspiracy theories are not only making people stupid, they're making them sick.
When you need answers first thing in the morning.
What's the key to progress to bringing this home and getting this deal done?
What is the military posture of the United States now toward Afghanistan?
You need your Morning Joe, only on MSNBC.
The highly contagious Delta variant of COVID-19 was first discovered in India. Variants can develop anywhere in the world, especially in countries with the lowest vaccination rates. Providing vaccines to the world is not an act of pure generosity. It is an act of self-defense that is necessary to help protect Americans from the spread of future variants.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
Do you feel like the bad guy in this? Why should they believe you when they know that people are getting in? Has it been worth it to make this trip? Do you feel like you're giving a green light to politicians? How do you explain why your case has become so important?
One bill would eliminate the requirement that students be taught the, quote, history of white supremacy, including but not limited to the institution of slavery and the Ku Klux Klan. American history is littered with shameful policies, but it is also filled with freedom fighters. To teach our children anything else is to rob them of their heritage and the truth, and they deserve better.
Get your daily dose of written perspectives about the issues that matter most. Start your day with MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.
Three-month prescription.
We are expecting to hear from a number of world leaders this morning. And right now, actually, I want to show you live the German chancellor, the new chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is speaking, just wrapped up, just walking away, of course, speaking about what has happened there. It is just about midday in Germany. We are looking at the morning turning into the afternoon in Ukraine as Russia continues what has been described as a full-scale attack there. That has been developing for the last several hours. But before those explosions began, the explosions that even live on our air in the last couple of minutes, you've been hearing with Aaron McLaughlin in Kyiv, our other correspondents around the country there. You had a different kind of attack with several of the country's government websites, banking websites hit with a cyber attack. Many of those websites are reportedly still down this morning. The Ukrainian cybersecurity officials that we're talking to say it was this kind of attack that shuts down a network's server. I want to bring in NBC News national security and global affairs reporter Dan DeLuce, former FBI special agent and MSNBC contributor Clint Watts, and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is the chief international security and diplomacy analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Admiral Stavridis, let me start with you with your extensive experience in the region. Reaction to what we have seen from Russia, reaction to the response that we've seen so far from the U.S. and NATO.
Putin has crossed his Rubicon. He has gone big. And we've been debating for a few weeks whether he would park and hold and try to take what he could off the table. He has really rolled the dice. So what you are seeing unfold is kind of reminiscent of the United States' approach in Iraq. This is shock and awe. This is Invasion 101. It's multi-axis. It's explosions all across the country. It's as big an event in international global security as I can remember, particularly given the fact that the Ukrainian military is pretty well armed, pretty highly motivated. Those are their families behind them facing Russian tanks rolling. It's a very serious moment.
What is your assessment of if this is what Putin started with, what happens next, what we can expect maybe in the next 24 hours?
Over the next 24 hours, you'll see him suppress the air defense systems. That's what that first wave of strikes will be. Secondly, you'll see another wave of cyber attacks. He'll want to degrade the Ukrainian command and control. He will want to knock out portions of the Ukrainian electric grid. He's going to attempt to terrify the population. That's not going to be hard. He'll want to burden the Zelensky government with refugee waves. And then behind all that will come his shock troops. These are going to be elite units, the 8th Infantry Guards of the Russian Armed Forces, a storied unit, the 1st Tank Brigades. They will come next. And I think they're going to try and cut off the Ukrainian bulk of the Ukrainian armed forces in southeast Ukraine. So look for a lot of moving pieces on the chessboard. He's put his foot on the accelerator. It's not going to come off for a while.
One of those pieces, Clint, as you well know, has been those cyber attacks. Put that into context for us.
That's right, Hallie. Much like we'd seen last week, we saw government websites and banks yesterday suffer a DDoS attack. This is a denial of service. This isn't a penetration necessarily of the networks, essentially flooding the websites so that no one can access them. Remember, this at a time when we also have runs on banks. So this is a critical function inside the country. Separately, there were scattered reports last night of both destructive malware attacks of companies inside Ukraine. There was some mention of Lithuania and Latvia, and I think this would be the start potentially of where Putin and Russia, in addition to using cyber as sort of their leading wave into the country, destabilizing, using it as a psychological weapon, then starts to use it in European Union and NATO more broadly. Specifically, I think Germany and France would need to worry because they've been part of the diplomatic process. I think Putin is probably waiting today to see how they come out in terms of their economic sanctions. But if it's particularly harsh and Putin wants to draw someone back into the negotiating table or sort of push them off to not do anything more, cyber is a great option for him as the aggressor. And so I think over the next few days, we really need to watch, is there any attack in Ukraine that starts to spread worldwide? We've seen that before. And is there any attack that is directed specifically towards Western Europe and the U.S.?
We are getting, Clint, as you are speaking, new reaction in from the North Atlantic Council, condemning in the strongest possible terms what they describe as Russia's horrifying attack on Ukraine, which is entirely unjustified and unprovoked. This fits with what we have seen from world leaders so far this morning, as there has been this international response mounted. Dan, I'll go to you here as you've been talking to folks, I know, over the last several hours about the national security response from the U.S. and from our allies.
That's right. I mean, in one sense, the U.S. and the West are bystanders. They are watching this unfold. And of course, there are no U.S. or NATO troops on the ground fighting this invasion. But you're right. NATO is going to be conferring, and the next step could be at some point activating this NATO response force, a very capable multinational force of several thousand that could be deployed and shifted to the eastern flank. We've already seen a continuous movement of thousands of U.S. and other NATO troops to shore up that eastern flank, to reassure the Baltic countries, Poland, and all those countries that worry about what Russia is going to do next. The other thing to point out here is there is this remote risk of some kind of an inadvertent collision or accident, a missile going astray. And there are U.S. forces in Poland just over the border and in Romania. And there is a communication channel that it does remain open between Russia and the United States. And that will be another thing Washington and NATO will be focusing on, is avoiding some kind of miscalculation.
Admiral Stavridis, with your extensive expertise with NATO, how important are the next 24, let's say 48 hours as it relates to the international response to Putin? I hear you in what sounds like an assessment that at this point he cannot be deterred. The function now is accountability.
It's accountability, and it's also reassurance for our NATO partners. Look, this is a good morning in Europe to wake up and be a member of the NATO alliance. And by the way, let's do the numbers here. Putin looks like he is going to roll through Ukraine, and he may get bogged down in a very serious fight with the Ukrainians. We'll see. I doubt seriously whether he would dare to cross a NATO border in anger for a number of reasons. But I'll tell you a principal one. NATO outspends Vladimir Putin on defense about 15-1. We have 3 to 4 million people under arms, almost all of them volunteers. That's 4 times the size of the Russian army. We have 50,000 combat aircraft. We have 800 warships. He is not going to pick a fight with NATO, ultimately. And that's why Dan is correct. What the alliance will be doing in these next 24 hours, not only convening in Brussels, you're going to see troops moving, troops, tanks, missiles, jets, warships. They're going to be headed to the borders of Russia. It'll send a pretty powerful signal and an incentive to Vladimir Putin to be careful about those NATO borders. I think he will be.
There's also what is sure to be the need for humanitarian help inside Ukraine at some point.
Very well said. And this is something that the Pentagon is very focused on. The units that have deployed already to Poland, to Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, around the borders and near Ukraine will be quite prepared to be helpful in that regard. That's a very practical element of the deployment alongside the symbolic value we just discussed.
Clint, final thoughts to you.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a very different situation unfold. That line of cars that you saw exiting Kyiv, that's going to be incredible to watch as they try and move towards safety. I don't think there's been too many times where we've seen an industrialized European country evacuate on little or no notice all at once. And just looking at that traffic jam there, as Admiral Stavridis said, you can imagine the fuel shortages that are quick to come as the Russians start to move further into Ukraine. I think separately is really seeing how well the Ukrainian military does. If they're able to actually hold off the Russian army, does that change Putin's calculus? I'm curious to see what might happen in the next 48 hours.
Dan, what's the top question you're asking your sources this morning?
This is going to be a test of the Ukrainian military, of the Ukrainian political leadership, and it's a test of the West. How are we going to respond? If there is a serious resistance that develops in Ukraine against the Russian invasion, how is the U.S., how are NATO going to arm and equip and support those Ukrainian forces going forward? I think we don't know how this is going to develop, but it'll be interesting to see if the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian army can hold off Russia to some degree.
Dan DeLuce, Clint Watts, Admiral James Stavridis, I am grateful to all of you for your time this morning. I know it's early. It has been a long night. It will be a long day. Thank you all. And thank you all for watching as we continue our special coverage right here on MSNBC of the crisis in Ukraine. Morning Joe starts right now.
Condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
They go straight to hell. Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations with
all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. So Sir Edward Grey lamented to a friend right before Britain's entry into World War I. This morning, the pronouncements are less Shakespearean. Instead, the Washington Post writes of a Ukrainian teenager calling his girlfriend, "You need to get up. The war has begun." As citizens of this besieged European nation scramble for ATM machines, gas, and grocery supplies, Russian troops are coming ever closer to their cities and their homes. And they're invading with rockets and raining across the country. As Vladimir Putin puts his own country in jeopardy, economically and politically, in a vainglorious effort to reconstruct an evil empire that killed 30 million of its own people before its own demise. Now the only question is, how will America and the West respond to this brutish use of power?
The attack began early in the morning, about 5 a.m. local time, from neighboring Belarus, Moscow's ally, with explosions in several cities across Ukraine, including the capital, Kiev. Air raid sirens rang out across Kiev, and Ukrainian officials reported that cruise or ballistic missiles targeted military control centers. Dozens of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed so far. Officials say mostly from airstrikes and rocket launches. Ukrainian President Zelensky declared martial law, closing schools and placing hospitals on high alert. There was a mass exodus as thousands tried to flee. The invasion began just minutes after Russian President Vladimir Putin said in a public address that he authorized military action because the West had pushed too far in trying to draw the country into NATO. He also warned other countries against any retaliation, saying, quote, "The response from Russia will be so severe that no foreign nations have ever experienced it before. All decisions have been made." Willie.
President Biden spoke to President Zelensky of Ukraine last night, and this morning President Biden will meet with G7 leaders. He says he will announce new sanctions against Russia this afternoon. The statement from the president reads in part, "The prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine tonight as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces." President Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and its allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable, a statement from President Joe Biden. Joining us now from Ukraine, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. Richard, what does it look like on the ground there this morning?
So there have been airstrikes and what appeared to be missile strikes in numerous parts of the country, mostly targeting military facilities. And I think we are still in the early hours of what could be a long campaign. I'm in Mariupol, which is in the southeast, and there has not been much damage in the center of the city, but I just came from the edge of the city, and a military communications facility had been struck. A military satellite dish was smoldering and tipped over. The Ukrainian military has just put out more video that it says are Russian attack helicopters attacking a military installation outside of Kiev. So according to the Ukrainian President Zelensky, this attack by Russia, which began about 8 hours ago, came in from 3 different locations: from the north, from Belarus, from the east, where Russia has had troops built up on the border, and from the south. And here in Mariupol, there is an uneasy calm. People are clearly nervous. The government has imposed a state of emergency, calling it martial law. Many people are lining up for gas, lining up at ATMs, crowding into supermarkets. But we have seen also more Ukrainian troops and tanks pulled closer into the city. So for now, it seems that the major urban centers in this country are still under government control, and that at this point in time, the airstrikes carried out by Russia, and at least apparently one helicopter strike, have all been on military facilities.
Richard, stay with us. I want to turn to NBC News senior international correspondent Keir Simmons in Moscow. Keir, for weeks now, the world has wondered, will Vladimir Putin do it? And if he does it, how will he do it? Well, we learned last night that, yes, he is happy to cross that line and that he has gone big in the early hours here.
That's right. And just picking up on what Richard was saying there, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, just now briefing Russian journalists, and he has just said that Russia's goal is to, quote, neutralize Ukraine's military potential. So question marks through the morning about exactly what the Russian aim is here, and clearly we need to take these things with a pinch of salt, because bluntly, there have been so many lies. But right now, Dmitry Peskov saying that is the goal, and that, I suppose you could say, does appear to fit with what's being reported by correspondents on the ground like Richard, that it is military targets that are being hit. And in fact, on Russian television, military leaders are telling the Russian public, and have intended the Russian public, that all morning Russians woke up here, Willie, to the state TV replaying President Putin's announcement. But I have to tell you, I have been out on the streets of Moscow this morning to speak to ordinary Russians. They are stunned. Many of them did not expect this, even despite the messaging from the Kremlin. Really, there were people coming up to us to try and tell us how upset they were. Take a listen.
It's a disaster. I don't approve it. I don't like it, and I don't want it to be like that at all.
I'm scared. I'm scared of this situation because I'm afraid that something will happen here, and I'm afraid of people who live in Ukraine.
You're afraid for them?
Yes, I have some relatives there, and I'm afraid of them.
It's horrible, yeah. It's horrible. It should be done by diplomatic way.
And we should just be clear, clearly, Willie, Russians who speak English are more likely, I think you could say, to be opposed to this action. The one man spoke to us in Russian, said he was in favor of it. But I think don't underestimate how shocked the Russians are. And one more point before I leave you. They're at banks. The dollars have run out in many parts of Moscow. We're hearing from one of our producers here, Joe, the dollars have run out. And what that tells you is that Russians are really frightened for their economy. They're frightened for watching the ruble plunge in value. They're going to try and get dollars, and they're not able to find them in some of the banks. And that may be an indication that President Putin still struggling to bring his country with him on this.
Thank you, Keir. Richard Engel, let me ask you, what is the mood of the troops you've been reporting on the front lines in Ukraine?
They were bracing for this, and they knew this was coming. Some people were living in a kind of suspended disbelief that it wouldn't happen, that Vladimir Putin wouldn't go all the way, that he would be deterred. But I think starting yesterday and the day before, when we saw a dramatic increase in the fire from the Russian-backed separatists, many of the troops that I spoke to thought that Russia was preparing the ground, that it was softening its targets. And I think at this early stage, we are still seeing that. There was not a massive shock and awe campaign like some U.S. officials anticipated. There wasn't a devastating cyber attack. There haven't been the beach assaults that some people had been speculating. So it seems at this stage that the Russian military is still probing. It is knocking out communications. It is knocking out the military's ability to defend the country and launch a counterattack potentially. But the soldiers do believe that this is still an early phase. And you've been seeing I was watching just this morning, the soldiers are mobilizing. They're setting up more checkpoints. They're trying to maintain civil order, and they are also on the lookout for sleeper cells. They are very nervous that Russia could have organized or infiltrated groups of locals who are sympathetic, who could suddenly come out and try and carry out acts of sabotage or try to take control of the streets.
So, Richard, I guess my question is regarding their attitudes. There's been some question as to whether they'll actually fight the Russians when they come in. Can you tell me what their attitude was toward that resistance? Is there a sense of determination that they are going to push back on the Russians, or do you expect a speedy retreat?
Well, it depends what the Russians throw at them so far. So far, we've been seeing airstrikes, missile strikes, some helicopter assaults, but we have not seen, at least as far as I'm aware, the full-on tank-to-tank battles that could be coming quite soon, and I think we will have to see what happens then when the Ukrainians are not just facing airstrikes at military facilities on the outskirts of cities, but when they are facing the full brunt of a Russian ground offensive. But many soldiers I've spoken to are committed. They do want to fight. They realize that their nation is at stake. Vladimir Putin made it very clear that his goal is to topple the government, which he describes as fascist and neo-Nazi, and Ukrainians are determined to, the Ukrainian military, I should say, is determined to the best of its ability to keep this going. But Ukraine's foreign minister has called for more sanctions and more weapons for the troops. And just a short while ago, President Zelensky said that there are injured soldiers in hospital, and he called for he issued a national appeal for people to donate blood.
Keir Simmons, yesterday, Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, wrote that an invasion will leave Russia diplomatically isolated, economically crippled, and strategically vulnerable. That has been the assessment, the clear-eyed assessment of most Western diplomats and Western leaders and Western observers. This is an attack that does not make sense economically for Russia, diplomatically for Russia, and quite frankly, in the long run, militarily for Russia. So it's caused a great deal of concern in the West that Putin would move forward against his own long-term interests. I'm curious, have you picked any of that up in Moscow from any military officials, any government officials, from any leaders, that concern?